number of ways, from kind of low quality to high quality. I do think that revision can do that. So I think for me it's often like time is what I need to figure out whether I like what I've written or not. I mean, because I usually am kind of liking it when I'm working on it, at least when I feel like I'm having the breakthroughs, even if it takes a long time to get there. But then I may look at it 3 months from then or 3 years from then and not like it at all. But I think one is always asking oneself whether this stuff is any good. Or I guess some writers are very, never have maybe don't have those moments of self-doubt. I mean, I sometimes think, I'm not sure about this, but I just love doing it. So, I don't get discouraged by the thought that maybe this stuff I've written here is just not that good, or I need to trash that and start with something new. But I don't know of any easy way to tell. I could give you one of those romantic things about if it blows the top of your head off, or that. Bob?
Do you see the popularity of poetry changing in America? I mean, traditionally we've been kind of slow on appreciating poetry compared to Europe, South America, where poets are celebrated in the streets. Their funerals are national holidays or national days of mourning. Do you see that changing in America, maybe as a result of the internet, or kind of the interest in smaller works of fiction as opposed to novels?
I don't know. I mean, sometimes you think that nobody's reading poetry. The only people reading poetry are the people writing it. Sometimes you can feel that way. But anybody who's running a literary journal that accepts poetry for publication will tell you that there's a lot of poetry being written and a lot of people interested in poetry. I think that poetry matters to people still in certain situations, even people matters to people who aren't poetry specialists. Sometimes you'll be surprised. Like I went to a Jeff City football game here a few weeks ago, my first Missouri high school football game. Ended up sitting by this guy whom I'd never met before, and he gets to ask me, who are you, what do you do, how'd you come to Missouri, all this. And I told him I was a poet, taught poetry at the university, and he said, I got a good friend I grew up with right here in Jeff City who's a poet. And I said, well, who's that? And he said, David Baker. And David Baker's a pretty well-known poet, and he is from Jeff City. And he said, before David published his first book, he was probably in his early 30s and starting to publish in magazines and journals. I was about to get married, and I had met my wife-to-be after I left Jeff City, so David didn't know her at all. But I wanted to have a poem read to her at our wedding, and I'm not a poet, so I contacted David, and I wrote him an email, and I just told him a bunch of stuff about our relationship. And I thought he would just write up something kind of simple. I didn't expect anything all that great. But he really put love and care into it, this guy said, and wrote this beautiful poem. And the fellow who was telling me the story said he had told David in that email that this guy and his wife-to-be would take these walks out to where this road would end, and it just became the road kind of ended, and then there was a slope, and they used to plant corn on either side of the kind of dim, dirty dirt road that went down, because it was like a paved road, and then it turned into a dirt road. But they weren't planting anymore down there, and he had told David in the email that they would sit there and look out across that land, and that's kind of a special place to them. So David latched onto that, and he wrote this beautiful poem called Volunteers, and it was about the volunteer corn that would come up down there, and he was likening true love unto volunteer corn that would come up even when nobody's babying it, and when there's a lot of adversity. And this guy's wife loved this poem, ended up cross-stitching it. He said, it's on our wall right now. And, sometimes it's something like that. It's not selling 200,000 books that tells you people like poetry. A story like that is heartening. And, I think, too, if the economy of this country continues to tank and we really fall on hard times, people might get more interested in poetry. I just have a feeling about that. We'll wait and see. So hopefully we'll all just be really poor here in a few years and loving poetry.
I wanted to ask you about where you find the metaphors, like a honeycomb, like a box of shells. Where does that come from? How do you do that?
Well, that's a good question, hard one to answer. I mean, I think some people have a tendency to see these similitudes, like, oh, look, that honeycomb looks like a box of shells. But you can also kind of train yourself to look for those things. And, if you're a writer, you know that great images will help you. So you're always looking for them. And I tell my poetry students to get kind of notebookish about this and, keep these things and look back at them from time to time. I think it's kind of like how if you start paying attention to your dreams. If you woke up every morning and wrote down what you had dreamed, you'd start remembering your dreams a lot better, and you might. I don't know that if it's that you'd have more interesting dreams or you just notice them more, but just the attempt to pay attention. Just the paying attention to things will help you big time in that regard, I think. And so whether or not you have a knack for it, a person could develop, I think, an eye for metaphor, probably. And just, because I don't know myself, how much of my metaphor making is owing to my practice and how much is owing to just kind of a natural tendency to do that. But I do know the practice helps. The deliberate paying attention and recording of these things, like keeping a notebook. What happens is if you start writing these things down and thinking about them, something you thought of, they'll start sticking to each other. Like something you thought of today will suddenly link up with something you thought 3 years ago that you still have in your notebook. It's all coming from you, and from the world that you live and move in. So pretty soon poems will start happening on their own almost, if you get really disciplined about that, I think.
Greg, most of the lines in your poems move really naturally, and there's a lot of surprising, really tasty metaphors in the poems. And I wonder how much revision goes into that work. Heather was asking what makes a good poem and a bad poem. How much, for a writer that can write in the way that you write, and it sounds like it's just coming right off the tongue, how much revision goes into that kind of poem?
It does vary from poem to poem because you do have those gift poems, but I'd say oftener than not, for me, it takes a lot of revision. A lot, because if you're trying to achieve naturalness of flow, you're going to have to work, I think, pretty hard for that. And particularly if you aren't willing to give up other things you're trying to do, like have certain kinds of word music and certain kinds of imagery. If you're juggling all these things at once and somehow you have to make all that seem natural, for me, it takes a lot of work most of the time. And getting outside of my own head for a second. Like when you're working on a poem, you can convince yourself that something is natural and flowing when really it's not. And if you step back from it and say, if I just came to this and read this, would I think this sounded weird and awkward? And that process of being so inside the poem and needing to step back from it is interesting and difficult to undertake. But thank you for the compliment. In a lot of the poems, I am going for a kind of naturalness of language. Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people that write prose reviews set aside a certain time of day, usually early in the morning.
Yeah.
So is poetry more spontaneous? It sort of just comes at moments, or do you have a certain time that you begin to write?
I don't know that it's more spontaneous. It may be if you're talking about a novelist versus a lyric poet, because you know, if a novelist is going to follow through, he has to really stick with that story for a long time, maybe years, maybe 10 years or so. You know, like we had a visiting writer at Lincoln the other day that talked about spending like 9 years on one book. But, you know, even within that novel, you could have all kinds of little anecdotes, all kinds of little images, so there's plenty of room for spontaneity. I don't think poetry is any more a matter of the, you know, winds of inspiration blowing on the alien harp or something. I think that there's a burst of inspiration that will come to you at weird times, you know. And that is that moment. That's the moment that the Romantic poets talk about, you know, that just that gift moment where you have this idea and you may write it in your notebook and it may be pretty good right there, but it needs work. But there's a difference, I mean, between having those moments and having them but also being willing to undertake the ardent work that it takes often to work that material into something really worth reading. Because a lot of times that burst, that thing you scribble in your notebook so fast because you're afraid that it's coming so fast you're not going to get it all down, is good but not really there yet. I mean, it's not quite a poem. And that business of taking that and working it into a poem is what takes discipline and, you know, just commitment.
I read a long poem today, the first time, you know, it was like 8 pages or so. And I wondered what the fine difference is between a long poem, because it had very much a storyline, and a short story that's well written. Do they almost overflow into one another?
Yeah, I mean, certain short story writers are so lyrical that their stories are very difficult to distinguish from like prose poetry. If there's a kind of like density and intensity to the short story that makes it feel like poetry, it'd be hard to say it's not poetry if the author told you it was. I mean, that's how we really figure out whether something's poetry or prose nowadays. It's what the author tells you. You know, I mean, anything you call poetry sort of is, you know. It's I mean, you could have some higher definition like what is true poetry, but that's a debate that is going to be going on until, you know, the Lord splits the eastern skies over yonder. So, I mean, in the world of publishing, a lot of times it comes down to what the author calls it. But if you're talking about like more traditional poetry, the difference can just be lineation, you know. Did you break the lines by hitting enter? Or did you break the line, did the lines break just sort of as a matter of chance, you know, when you got to the edge of the page and, you know, wrapped around. But now with prose poetry, you can't even use that. So, I mean, I read those short stories of, say, Dylan Thomas and think, well, now how's this different from his poetry? I mean, they are a little different, but if he had called them poetry, I'd have said, okay. You know, in a lot of shorts and like flash fiction pieces, I would accept as poetry had the authors called them that.
Was there any poet that inspired you to write poetry, or, you know, that you liked the best?
There were certainly poets whom I looked to as models when I was first starting out.
Yeah.
But you know, as I said before, I didn't really come to poetry through reading poetry and thinking, I want to do that. I was crazy in love with language, wanted to mess with it, then realized there was this thing called poetry that I was sort of already doing without realizing that I was doing it. But then once I started writing poetry, thinking about it that way, calling myself writing poetry, I was really liking Dylan Thomas and Wallace Stevens, T.S. Eliot. Those were some Shakespeare. Those were some poets I liked a lot early on. And then later I fell in love with Yeats, and another Arkansas poet named Frank Stanford I really like. I mean, I've liked so many poets now, but I think that maybe those ones I named were the really important ones early when I was a kid, just a little kid. I liked how you could read a Dylan Thomas poem and get that the language was totally delicious before you had a clue as to what the poem was about. It was always about language first, it seemed like, and I would, like a poem like The Emperor of Ice Cream, I would just love, before I had any notion whatsoever what was going on in it, at the level of plot. And Dylan Thomas was that way for me. So because I was coming to poetry as this little kid who was just gleeful about language, I liked poets who had that boyish sense of linguistic play and who obviously were just luxuriating in the language. I think that's why those poets were so important. Leslie?
Greg, any particular stressful or memorable moments as you were working with the editor doing the final revisions?
Yeah, and I'd like to say Leslie Youngblood's here tonight. She's my colleague in the creative writing program at Lincoln and does a great job teaching fiction, and I'm really proud to be her colleague. Thanks for coming, Leslie. All right, so the editors. Well, I really liked the folks I worked with at Northwestern. They were great, they were fun, really just easy to work with. But the copy editing was arduous. Because, every syllable of the manuscript is just scrutinized. And I liked that. I was glad they were doing that. So many poetry books seemed to be kind of poorly edited to me. And I was really happy to be working with people that really cared that much about every little punctuation mark. But because I'm like that too, we didn't see eye to eye on some things. And so like the word voodoo comes up in the manuscript quite a bit, and the copy editor wanted to make that lowercase because it was lowercase in Webster's dictionary or something. And I wasn't using it like, let's do some voodoo with the economic system or something like that. I was talking about the religion voodoo. And I said, I understand that Webster says it's lowercase, but I think Webster's needs to revisit that because it's a religion. It's like putting a little c on Christianity. And so I think there's some kind of bias reflected in that decision on the part of Webster's to make it lowercase, because I looked at Webster's and only these religions from cultures that the West has traditionally looked askance at had names, were lowercase named. And so we just had that debate, and there were little things like that. They were nice about it, but, I had to make a case. They weren't just going to, do whatever I said. So, yeah, we had lots and a lot of discussions over stuff like that. Every little comma. Is this a restrictive or a non-restrictive a positive? Should we have commas or not? I mean, All right, well, thank you so much for your questions. And it was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Greg. Thanks everybody for coming. I'm sorry we don't have refreshments, but so be it. I think we're refreshed enough. And not only that, but we're going to have somebody call Webster to revisit that issue, because I love a man that will question the dictionary. Thank you, Greg. Thank you all for coming.
I do have books if anybody wants to buy books. They are $15 each.